We get asked this all the time. It's a really difficult question to answer. And it's not really through being evasive or anything like that. I think there are so many variables, but that shouldn't excuse starting to understand it or trying to measure it. So I think first and foremost, you need to look at prevention of former tenant debt and what are the metrics you can put in place around that. There are all those pressures that tenants face, moving costs, furnishing, navigating the benefits landscape, your other debts, putting right any repairs. So it's against quite a difficult backdrop for that leaving tenant. But some of the metrics you might want to consider are whilst they're still a current tenant. So average arrears on termination, I think that's really important. If you can measure that by team, by patch, by officer, you get a good sense of how well end of tenancies are being managed by that team or those staff. I think looking at the percentage of tenants that leave you in rent arrears is really important. Even tenants who pay rent really well and have a seamless history, those last 2 or 3 weeks of that tenancy is where it can all start to go wrong. So I think measuring that's important. Things like the collection rate in the last 4 weeks, just honing down on your organisation collection rate in the final 4 weeks of tenancy. If you start to measure it, you can start to develop your processes around that and try and improve on it. And I think if you do those things, your current tenant arrears will actually improve and your debt that's transferred to former tenant arrears should fall. I think when it comes to former tenant debt themselves, it is difficult to establish what a good collection rate looks like because there's so many variables at play. There's things like the age of debt. The newer the debt, more likely you are to collect it. Some organisations have quite a misbalance in the age of debt and the profile that they have. The type of debt that is there is important. You know, what is the source of that debt? How's it come about? Is it a tenant who was deceased, for example, or was evicted or moved on voluntarily? They can all play a role in how likely you are to recover that former tenant debt. I think as a starting point, some of the good things to think about measuring would be collection by age of the debt and break it down that way. Looking at officer performance is an obvious one. Certainly the officer who is responsible for collecting the former tenant debt, but also looking at the officer who held that account as a previous current tenant. I think that's really important as well, and having understanding if there's any relationship there between them and the debt that occurs. Of course, that helps you to develop any training needs or recognise good performance, best practice, that type of thing. I think debt transferred to write-off is a really important measure as well. With a former tenant arrear, there's only 2 ways it's going to go. It's either collected or it goes to write-off. And if you can start to understand that, you can start to manage it in the right way. Then there are obvious things, payments taken. I think looking at transactions that are, you know, arrangements, that sort of thing that have been made are important because in most cases that's how a former tenant debt would end, would be some sort of arrangement.